Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar all about distributed learning this time with me, Arf Moore from Tutorful. So today we are going to be focusing on this thing called distributed learning. Thank you to everyone who is watching this live or as a recording. Remember, if you are watching it live, you can ask me questions in the chat function. Either ask me or you can put in the group function and everyone can see them, and I will keep coming to those questions. If you are watching this as a recording, I would still suggest that you write down those questions as we go. It's a great way to kind of keep engaged. Write down the questions, have they been answered? And if not, you can come and find me on LinkedIn or something at the end of the session to ask me further questions. Very briefly, my name is Arf Moore. I'm a full-time online maths tutor and have been since 2021. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher working in schools across the UK and internationally. And I've worked in a real range of schools, state schools, international schools, boarding schools, independent schools, state schools, all through schools, big schools, small schools. I have two outfits. I run my tutoring via More Edu, and in 2024 was the winner of the National Tutor of the Year from the Tutors Association. And this year I was actually lucky enough to judge the awards. And I also run a training outfit for tutors regarding their own CPD called Navigator Tutor, which has been shortlisted for several awards, including Educational Resource for Tutors in the 2025 awards. But that's enough about me. Let's get into this topic of distributed learning. So our aims for today's session are to discuss why we forget things, explain different methods of content delivery, and discuss some techniques on how to actually implement those different methods into your tutoring. And it all comes up down to this idea here. How many times have you taught a session or started a session where you've started or said the line, oh, we did this last week, why can't we remember it? Or we did this before, why can't you remember it? And the key here is to remember that everyone forgets things, absolutely everyone. The students forget, we forget, everyone forgets. And I really like this line from Dada and Rose: forgetting is both endemic and entirely predictable. It's a completely predictable thing. And because it's predictable, we want to come up with ways in which we can work around it. So we want to be thinking, we know students are going to forget things. How can I help reduce that effect? And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today. So before then, I want to go into a little bit of idea of what is performance and learning. Now, if you want this in more detail, you can go to a previous webinar on performance and learning. But I'm going to talk about these two ideas very briefly because they are really important for these models that we're going to be talking about shortly. So performance is what we observe students doing. It's what they are very much performing. Think of the word performing in a specific moment. And because it's something we're observing, it's something we can measure. And it's often from this thing that we are observing, this thing we are measuring, that we infer where learning has happened. So we see a student do something and we infer from that that learning has taken place. The problem with this is performance, the thing that the students is actually doing, is actually a relatively short-term impact of being taught something. So if I ask you to do something and you instantly do it, well, you've performed it, but you haven't necessarily learned it. And research actually suggests that this idea of performance actually hinders longer term learning. If we just focus in on performance, we actually have a negative impact upon our longer term learning. And that's something we need to be thinking of. Whereas learning is the idea of the retention of knowledge. It is a change in our long-term memory. Again, if you want more detail on long-term memory, working memory, there's some previous webinars that we can go into some more details on those. But without that change in memory, i.e. a change in how our brain is working, what we're seeing is just a performance. Learning is an ongoing process where the learner is accumulating knowledge and making connections with things they have previously learned. Performance is a single moment in time. And again, short-term performance is a poor proxy for this idea of long-term learning. So it's just a little recap. If you want to go into that in more detail, there's another webinar all about performance and learning. So what we're going to be talking about today is distributed learning. And what this is all about is it's thinking about the order of how we are delivering content in order to prioritize that idea of learning over performance. So as tutors, what we're really concerned with is the long-term learning of our students. Yes, they may have a test the next day, or we may be thinking very short term, but really our goal is to help them learn things longer term. And one of the ways in which we can do this is to think about the ways we are delivering content. And I'm going to talk about 3 styles we have for delivering content, all of which have their place. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of them and think about how they apply to our tutoring. Again, if you're watching this live, please feel free to jump on the questions and ask me a question, and we'll come to those as we're going forward. So the first thing I want to talk about is blocked practice. Now, fundamentally, block practice means teaching one skill and then moving on to the next one. So we teach something, then we teach another one. And this kind of links with the classic school method that those of you who have worked in schools will recognize. I taught Shakespeare, and now I'm going to teach some poetry, and now I'm going to teach some non-fiction. Done. I've taught them everything. I'm now going to do a test. And if I like to think about this as like textbooks are typically developed in this way. They have different chapters, different sections. And you can think about block practice as looking like this. So we do topic A, we move on to topic B, then we move on to topic C, and then we finish with topic D. A very typical way. And I'm sure if you take a moment to reflect upon this, this is how a lot of our tutoring works. We do some stuff. Next week, we do some other stuff. Next week, we do some other stuff. And that's because typically with a lot of our students, we're following how the school curriculum is classically designed. Do something, do something else, do something else, do something else. Now, block practice absolutely has some benefits. It's really easy for us to do as educators. I need to teach this, so I'm going to teach this in 3 or 4 sessions. I need to teach this, I'm going to teach this in 2 sessions. It's really good for introducing a topic because your student gets to see things again and again and again. It's very good when we're introducing new topics. And parents and students really recognize it as a thing. Oh, for this month, we're going to do this. Next month, we're going to do that. And students and parents really recognize that. And so they don't have any kind of questions and worries about it. Now, the negative side of blocked practice is it does have limited impact on actually the longer term learning of our students. And this is because it promotes performance. If you just think back to the model we just saw, that's because I learn something and then I perform it. I learn something, then I perform it. I learn something and then I perform it. I learn something and then I perform it. And we see these performances and we go, well, that was good, 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 good. This has been learned. Whereas the problem is, were we just looking at something being performed after we taught it, or has there actually been a longer term learning? And that's one of the things we need to think about with block practice. So I'm going to talk about other methods, but I really want to emphasize that block practice really has a place in our tutoring. It's really good for introducing new topics. And it's also very easy for us when we're working with our students over kind of a course of time to kind of structure our learning. Does anyone have any questions about the idea of block practice there? I'll just go to its positives and negatives again. But if anyone's got any questions, please just let me know. So someone has asked me, why does it promote performance? It's because we are doing something and then instantly looking back upon those things we have done. So if I ask you to reverse round a corner in your driving lesson, I show you how to do it, and then you instantly do it, well, you have performed it. I'm very happy that I've seen you do it. But if I come back a week later, it's not guaranteed that you have learned that. But in the moment you were able to perform it because I showed you it, maybe repeatedly, maybe literally for 2 lessons in a row, we just did a 3-point term. I saw you do it. I assume you have learned it. Doesn't mean several months later, you're still going to be able to remember it when it comes to your term. And that's why it's got a limited impact, because it is looking rather short term as the student. And that's why it's kind of easy to do, because we can do something and then we see our student doing it. And from that, we infer learning, taking us back to our conversation earlier. Excellent question. And before I move on to the next method, I just want to remind us of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. Again, we looked at this in more detail in a previous webinar, but this is all about why we forget things. So essentially, it's a study from 1885. So it's a good 140 years old, but it's actually been replicated again and again in loads of modern studies. And essentially, the idea is as time elapses, the percentage of information we've been taught, we forget, which kind of feels quite intuitive, I think, when you think about this. But what Ebbinghaus found is that if we review the data at different points, our retention of the data stays for longer. So if we look here, here's the original learning, and then we reviewed it. And then we reviewed it again. And what you'll notice each time here is the steepness of the curve, the drop-off, reduces. So by the time we're doing our second review, I'm retaining that information. I'm retaining more information for a longer period of time. Now, what I'm not doing on this curve is putting specific percentages or specific times. That's a lot more detail, and it's a lot more kind of open to interpretation. So this is not the thing of like, you have to wait a week, then 2 weeks, then 3 months. But it's the idea that if we keep reviewing information, we are more likely to remember it. And also what you can see here is the gaps between these bits are longer each time. So we can review things quite quickly, then a bit longer, and then a bit longer. And this brings me the idea of spaced practice. Now, spaced practice means, unsurprisingly, spacing out studying as opposed to just filling in all at once. So if we look here, the topic A has been split up. Topic B has been split up. Topic C has been split up. Topic D has been split up. There's a bit of space in between the factors. Now here, there's a huge amount of research that supports this idea as being more effective for future recall of knowledge. We remember more stuff for longer. Now, the gap here, even though I've said like the timers don't really we're not quite sure of, I wouldn't go into too much details about though. But essentially what these gaps do is they lower a chance for the student to reload the memory. We're coming back and we're reviewing the data to reload the memory. And because of that, the memory is strengthened. If you think about learning a song that you sing along to, if you just heard it 3 times in a row on the radio, well, you might be able to sing along to it the 3rd time. You might be able to sing along to it the 3rd time. And then you hear another song that you're singing along to the 3rd time. But this is not necessarily that longer term you're going to be able to remember these songs. However, when we come to something like spaced learning, the intervals of which we are seeing these songs are different. And that means we're getting more chance to reload our memories. If you look here, A is being reloaded several times, B is being reloaded. And this is just an example. So here are some ideas of how spaced practice might look. So we review key quotes from a text after we've actually finished that topic. So I finished the topic, but in my session next week, I start with some key quotes from that, or a couple of weeks later. That's a way of me going back and reviewing that data, getting my student to recall that information. I do an exit ticket. So an exit ticket is a question you do at the end of the session, but I do on a topic that I covered with that student last month. So just in our last 5 minutes, here's a question on a topic that we did a while ago. Again, It's just giving a student a chance to reload that memory, which is going to strengthen them longer term. Or if you set your students homework, you might set them some homework, but on a topic that has been previously covered. So something that's been previously covered allows them again to reboot that memory, which strengthens it. Now, space practice, one of its benefits is each topic is being regularly revisited. And this helps with retention. And there's loads of studies and research that will benefit that. One of the negative sides is often us educators are looking for this ideal optimal gap, and it really doesn't exist. So that's one of the things we need to look out for. But it's all based around this idea that if we are coming back and reloading our memory, we got more chance of kind of remembering it longer term. I'm going to go through some more examples of how we might do this in class, but I was just wondering right now, does anyone have any questions about this idea of space practice? So essentially, it's the idea of just spreading out how we are reviewing information. Okay, so here's some examples. So we can do these in very quick ways. So for example, if I've just done Macbeth, maybe a couple sessions later, at the start or the end of the session, I do a quick matching exercise. I get the quotes, can you match it to the character? Now, even though it sounds like quite a simple exercise, what the student is doing there is they're having to recall a lot of information. Apologies, a bit hot in here. They have to recall lots of this information. And because they're doing that, they're more likely to remember it longer term. The way I think about it is, if this is where we are teaching our student, and this is where we are testing our student, they are going to forget things in that interim. Whereas what this moment does here, this little recap, is it takes us back up like Ebbinghaus's curve reflect, and then we're less likely to forget longer term. So there's a big difference. And that's what Ebbinghaus's curve is telling us. So something like matching quotes to characters. I do this a lot in mathematics by getting them to label diagrams. And maybe getting to label diagrams on topics we have done a while ago. So I do a lot of kind of notating circles, or doing a trigonometry triangle, which is the hypotenuse, which is the opposite. Is this, what type of triangle is this, is what I would do in maths. And I do those fairly regularly. They can be very quick activities, but they are a way of spacing out kind of the learning of that information. We can do a quick recap of key terminology. So every single one of my sessions I do, I always start with a recap of some key terminology. And sometimes it will be linked to the lesson, sometimes it won't be, but it's just about recapping that learning. So these are quick little methods I can do for retrieval practice. Or I can do some brain dump activities. And we spoke about this in previous webinars, how brain dumps are giving students a chance to write down all the information they know about something on a page. And it's a really useful way of them kind of recalling information. Does anyone have any questions about brain dumps? I'm just going to give everyone a moment to just reflect upon kind of space learning in their subject area and see if there's anything there. Okay, so someone was just asking about kind of the way this works. So it's not so much you have to follow this at all. It's just the idea of spacing out the delivery of learning. So if you can see here, I've delivered some content here. So maybe I've done some stuff with trigonometry. And then as I'm moving on to right and non-right angle trigonometry, I do that later. But it's forcing the student to kind of reload their information, reload their memory. And that just has so many longer term benefits here. Like the research is really strong on space practice, really being strong for our students trying to remember stuff longer term. So it's a really, really important idea. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk about interleaving. So interleaving, as you can see there, is a lot more mixed up. And what interleaving is about is it is about mixing up different types of tasks and problems. And it's given our students multiple opportunities to retrieve information. It's all about manipulating the order and the timing of tasks. And by mixing up that order in which the topics are covered, students are practicing different types of problems in different ways. And that boosts longer term learning. Again, what we are doing here is we are really focusing on this idea of longer term learning as opposed to short term performance. So what we're doing here at every stage is we are trying to promote learning over performance. I'm going to talk about this a bit more into more detail, but this whole thing about interleaving really is about putting learning at the forefront rather than just getting our students to perform. Because as you can see, if I here just get my students to perform stuff, I haven't done stuff as many times. I haven't blocked it out as much. So the short-term performance is going to be longer. But by the time I get to here, the hope is that our longer-term memory has been strengthened. So this is all about promoting learning over memory. So everything here that we're talking about, I'm not saying is going to make each of your individual sessions stronger, but it will make them as a series of lessons, as a group longer term with your students, they will remember more. So an example of interleaving. So for example, in PE, instead of focusing on a sport, I would do cricket, then baseball, we might teach a skill, e.g. throwing, and then apply that to different situations. Now that's a form of interleaving because we are doing different things in order. So we might do some cricket, then baseball and stuff like that, but we are mixing up the scenario in which they are being taught. So the actual skill is being taught in different ways. When teaching phonics, you might look up similar sounds, cow and bow, and we might get the students to distinguish between their similarities and differences. And this is a really key idea that we're going to talk more of, similarities and differences. I might show the skill we've done, but applied in different contexts. For example, in maths, I might give them these problems here. So if I look at each of these three problems, they are all questions about Pythagoras, essentially. But I'm mixing up the content in which it is being delivered. So there's a lot more recalling of information. I'm putting the focus on the student recalling information, which is going to have a longer term impact. And interleaving absolutely leads to improved memory because we're coming to stuff in different orders. It's training our mind to work in a slightly different way. It helps with strategy selection. Now, what I mean by strategy selection is when a student looks at an unfamiliar question in an unfamiliar context and scenario, and they think about which skill do I need? And because they've had more practice of seeing different questions in different scenarios, they are better placed to choose the topic on what to do. It really focuses on comparing and contrasting ideas. And because we're comparing and contrasting, that really links to our idea of meaningfulness, which we did a previous webinar on, where our bodies of knowledge are more linked. We can see the similarities and differences between things, and that actually strengthens and anchors our knowledge more. And also interleaving, which is about mixing up the order in which we deliver stuff, also includes all the benefits of spacing because it is a form of spacing. We're still splitting up how we deliver things. Now, it is really difficult to do. Absolutely. It's one of the most challenging aspects of teaching that we'll talk about in any of these webinars. Interleaving is a really hard thing to do well because it's really quite counterintuitive. And because it's counterintuitive to what we nearly do, it needs to be explained to students and parents. Because what we are doing here is promoting longer term learning over short term performance, we might see a drop in short term performance. So at the end of your session, because you've not blocked it in such a way, or your topics, you may have done, rather than doing 3 topics on poetry and then doing some assessment, your student, oh, I can do all this. Because you're only doing one and then you're doing something else and then you're coming back to it, the student might feel their performance is dropping. So we need to explain to them that what we are focusing on is this longer term retention of knowledge. Does anyone have any questions there before I'm going to go into some more example of interleaving? Okay, so someone's just asking what's the real difference between interleaving and spacing. Probably the best ways to see this. So spacing is literally just, I'm still going kind of A, B, C, D. You can see the order there. Sorry, someone's just put another question up. I'll come to that in a second. We're still doing the same order. Whereas interleaving, what interleaving does is it does mix up the order. So we can see here D has come here before B, where spacing was kind of always the same order. So it's mixing up that order. Someone's asked, is the LITNA system, which we talked about in the previous webinar, to do with flashcards, space practice? Absolutely. And what the LITNA system does, which you can go back and learn more on in the flash, it was under flashcards, was all about retrieval, was the name of the webinar. Is what the LITNA system does is it spaces out the stuff that you need to come back to. So the stuff you're getting wrong, you are coming back to again and again and again. Whereas the stuff that you're more confident with, you come to less often. And that's what we want. Again, if we look at the Ebbinghaus's curve, we don't want to be reviewing stuff every single day doesn't necessarily help us. We want to come back to it just as we're starting to forget things. So we do want to forget a little, and then that review helps us. And that's what the LITNA system does really well. Really good question there. So again, interleaving is all about the manipulation of the order of the tasks. And it is all about interconnecting topics. And the reason that works is it helps our mental structures interconnect, making them stronger. And means they're more flexible in how we use them because we've got essentially a better foundation of knowledge. It strengthens the schemas in our brain. And that is how it boosts longer term learning. So here are some ideas. When you're teaching, be very conscious to draw comparisons with different areas within your subjects. Sometimes we want to stay on topic, and obviously sometimes that's brilliant. We want to do that. But sometimes we want to be very much like, this is different to this. Let's talk about those differences. So A-level mathematicians watching. When I teach differentiation and then integration, when I'm teaching that second part of integration, I will very much draw its links and differences to differentiation. If you're doing fiction and non-fiction and you're looking at 2 texts, be very clear to draw the comparisons between the 2, the language being used. If in science you're looking at how 2 molecules interact in certain situations, we'll talk about how different things would interact at different moments. It's really important that your students see those comparisons. It will help them make connections, and connections strengthen everything. Does anyone have any questions about that idea of drawing comparisons? What I'd like to do actually is just think back to the last lesson you did, whatever your subject was. And I just want you to think about a topic you did. And what topic could you have linked that to? And I'm not saying you then deviate in doing that, but where was the natural link? So I'll just give everyone a few moments to think about that. Whether you're watching live, you want to share that on the chat, or whether you're watching this as a recording. And I'll also share when I did this recently. So I did this recently where I was doing some work with a student on trigonometry. We were doing right angle trigonometry, which is working with right angle triangles. And we spoke about very explicitly the similarities of these questions with Pythagoras questions. But we also spoke about the differences between them. And at the end, the student was able to say, well, in this situation, I need to use Pythagoras. In this situation, I need to use trigonometry. Even though the title, the topic that we were focusing on was trigonometry. I made a point of drawing that comparison because it helped the student with their method selection going forward. So when you're kind of drawing those similarities in like phonics, if you're an early years tutor, be very clear to highlight the similarities and differences in words. So talk about when the magic E happens as opposed to the other words, when it's just following phonetically. Talk about why that might be the case. Because then your student is much more likely to be able to spot those patterns going forward, even though patterns in the English language are incredibly hard to see. In art, you might teach a skill and then apply that skill to different contexts. So teach them a skill and then do different types of drawing or drawing different objects rather than the topic is drawing that object. Teach the skill and then apply that to different ones. Like when we spoke about to do with the English example or the PE example. In English, create time in your lessons to discuss the similarities and differences. Different types of sonnets. Because if we just teach sonnets in a very singular way, our student might leave with the idea that a sonnet has to follow kind of a Shakespearean pattern, and they are the Shakespearean things. Whereas if we teach different times sonnets interleaving within those, and maybe we also interleave this with different types of poems, our students get a much stronger idea of where sonnets sit within poems and poems sit within kind of other aspects of the English curriculum. But you have to create time to do this. Like, feel free in those sessions to go off and talk about other things. Hopefully you've seen within this webinar, I've linked it to other webinars and talked about the ideas that are coming through. And hopefully when I've mentioned those other webinars, you've gone, oh yeah, I remember when we've gone over that. But I've used the Ebbinghausen's forgetting curve in several of these webinars by design on purpose, because hopefully we come back to it again and again, and we're seeing how it works in different scenarios. Does anyone have any questions there about any of those techniques or anything to share? I'll just give everyone a moment to kind of reflect, or if anyone wants to share anything or ask any questions. Okay, cool. So a couple of questions here. So someone was just asking about this idea of consciously. Like, how do I consciously draw comparisons? I would literally be saying to my students, like, can you spot any similarities with any other topics we've done recently? That's a really nice kind of introduction to this. And then what you can do is say, well, here's another topic. Can you see the link between these two topics? Or can we talk about the differences? So can we talk about the differences between these shapes? Can we talk about the differences between these artist styles? Can we talk about the differences between this type of poem and this type of poem? Can we talk about the differences in how these two molecules interact with a certain situation? Can we talk about the similarities and differences between the Tudors and the Edwardians? And all those discussions lead to much deeper understanding, but also they help with that memory retention. Because if we think back to the spider web we spoke about in a previous webinar, it just strengthens that spider web of knowledge. And then when we learn something new, we've got even more things that it can anchor to. That's what's really nice about it. Someone's just asked to go back to this maths example here. So the reason this works as interleaving is the topic here is the same. So I've very specifically chosen these three questions. I haven't just chosen random three questions. The skill was the same, but the student is having to apply that skill in very different contexts. And because of that, that skill becomes a lot more strong and flexible going forward. So they don't just associate Pythagoras and says, well, it has to look like this for me to do Pythagoras. They can recognize that even when things don't look the similar, that Pythagoras is still a skill that can be used there. So they don't just go, well, this doesn't look like that, so it cannot be Pythagoras. And that leads to much more adaptable knowledge. I talked about a lot about driving cars in previous webinars. If you only make reference points with your single car on like how much fuel's left, like we all know in our car, when it goes down to the red, like how much longer we have, that might be slightly different for a different car. But once you drive enough cars, you kind of get a reference point for how's that going to be. Or when you're parking the car, if you only ever, we're all very good at kind of reversing into our own drive, but sometimes when we go to someone else's drive, we get all like, we don't know what to do. That's just because our context we're working in slightly differently. Whereas interleaving, if I'd learned to reverse park in loads of different car parks the whole time, I'd always be doing it. And sometimes I reverse park, sometimes I didn't, sometimes do this. My reverse parking would be a lot better. And that's why, as you drive more, your skills in those kind of areas get a lot more flexible and adaptable. So I always like talking about those. I think cars are a really nice analogy for these. And it would be an example I would use with my older students or with my parents, because again, I'm having to discuss with them this idea of I'm promoting your child's learning over their performance. And once you explain that to parents, they really do get on board with this because that's what they want. And when you talk to a student, you say, like, the classic conversation I have a lot of times is, why are you looking for tutoring? And quite often be, I can do the stuff in class, but when it comes to the tests, I really struggle. And that's because they've confused performance with learning. I could do it in this class, I could perform it. So why haven't I learned it? And we talk about the idea of how kind of the brain works when it comes to learning and remembering stuff. And once I really push that with my students, they start to get on board with it. And then they start to see the effects of it. And that's when you get real buy. Like distribute, this comes onto my kind of reflection here. Distributed practice is hard to incorporate into your learning. Like we want to do block practice. And again, I'm not saying block practice has no place. It does this because it will sometimes feel like you're going against what is right for your student in that moment, because you're not focusing on just one skill until they can do it. And because of that, sometimes the short-term performance may take a dip, and that feels a bit kind of counterintuitive to us. But I say all this as a tutor who uses the stuff we spoke about today. And it's important for us all to remember that learning essentially takes time and repetition. It is not a single moment. So just because you taught something brilliantly in a moment, and I'm sure you have taught stuff absolutely brilliantly, it doesn't mean the student will be able to do it again next week. And that's really annoying, isn't it? When we're students like, I taught this really well. You could do this last week. It was a really good lesson. And that's sometimes because we've seen their performance and we've inferred learning from it rather than focusing on learning at the start. And the key takeaways here, just to remember that we all forget things, and that is completely normal, and to embrace that idea. So rather than saying, why are we forgetting things? We can say, well, how can I help my students forget less, and it takes them longer to forget less? And it's all about the recalling of information. And that's the thing we really want to promote with our students. And space learning, which is actually fairly easy to implement, just coming back to topics repeatedly, that increases our recall of information. And recalling information is the key to remembering stuff more. And it's a really nice thing to just bring into your session. Just in your next session, just start with something you did a month ago. So I quite often with my students, I will look up a topic we did a month ago. I will look at the slides we did. I'll just grab a question and I will just give it to that student. And I'll see if that retention is still there. And it's just about, I would keep asking myself, am I giving my students opportunities to recall information, but in different contexts? I don't just want them recalling the same information. I want them recalling that information and doing something slightly different with it, because that's where the memory gets really strong. If you want more about this, there's a brilliant book about strengthening the student toolbox, which got loads and loads of practical rules. Example, it's called Dunlopsky's Strengthening the Student Toolbox, of part of the Inaction series, and it's by someone called Amabir Singh Gill, who is an absolute genius when it comes to this stuff. But this is what I would really be thinking about: is, am I giving my students opportunities to recall information so I can promote recall over forgetting? All with the idea of I'm looking at long-term memory over the short-term performance. If you want to ask any more questions about me, anything on this, please come and find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place. You can just find me by searching R4More Tutor, or search that QR code there, or have a little listen to the free podcast that I run where tutors share a top tip, or you can join the free WhatsApp group I share where we share little tips. And if you want to learn more about Navigator Tutor, there is a QR code there. We can learn even more about all this. But the best place to find me really is on LinkedIn to ask me any of these questions. But here are the takeaways that I would really take away from today. And my favorite thing to do in all these topics is just being conscious to draw comparisons. I think because it's not something that takes a massive change in your tutoring method. This is just about asking questions, but it will make a big difference. I think that's something you can really do really easy. So thank you to everyone who's joined live. I'll stay on the call if anyone wants to ask any questions at the end here. Or I'm more than happy for you to find me on LinkedIn and ask me those questions there, where I do a lot more writing about all these ideas here. But thank you everyone for joining today. I will stick around if anyone has any questions. But thank you so much. Really appreciate the feedback. Have an awesome rest of your day, everyone.